Welcome to the second and final day of this weekend's First World War seminar arranged by the Fritt Ord Foundation. First of all, I would like to give a special thanks to all our distinguished guests who have come from afar and provided us with so many interesting insights about the First World War. I would also like to thank Professor Jay Winter for his very inspiring talk yesterday about remembering the Great War 100 years on. Jay Winter is Charles J. Still Professor of History at Yale University, and he is an influential scholar in the study of the First World War and its impact on the 20th century. His other interests include remembrance of war in the 20th century through memorials and mourning sites, as well as the social and economic history of war. His many publications include Socialism and the Challenge of War, Ideas and Politics in Britain, 1912 to 18, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, The Great War in European Cultural History, and The Great War Between History and Memory in the 20th Century. Professor Winter was also the co-producer, co-writer, and chief historian for the PBS series The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, which won an Emmy Award, a Peabody Award, and a Producers Guild Award for Best Television Documentary in 1997. Professor Winter is the co-director of the project on capital cities at war, Paris, London, Berlin, 1914 to 1919. Today, he will give us a lecture on how the Great War changed these three cities and how maintaining the welfare of their inhabitants contributed to affect the outcome of the war. On behalf of the Fritt Ord Foundation, it is my very great pleasure to introduce him to you today.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think I'm going to try to pass some degree of legislation that introductions should be one line long and stop there. It's very hard to follow on this list of former publications. What I want to do today is to vary my presentation from today, which is what I talked about in the discussion of contemporary commemoration of the Great War, to both yesterday and tomorrow. And what I want to do is to introduce what I hope will be the future direction of First World War studies, which is transnational history. And I want to introduce it to you in terms of work that has already begun and which has, I think, a very great potential to enrich and deepen the construction and dissemination of national histories. That is to say, transnational history is national history written from a global perspective. And I want to do this in terms of a discussion of how this moment today of historical writing about the First World War fits in to earlier currents in the historiography and to see what it borrows from them. Because really what we have to understand is that all historical writing, and certainly all historical writing about the First World War, is dialogic. It's reaction to earlier interpretations, which are alive and well and frequently stimulate either conjectures or objections, differences, as much as extensions of earlier arguments. So I want to start off by telling you a bit what transnational history is and why it's so difficult, why it hasn't developed before, but also to tell you how it fits in with earlier interpretations before moving towards a demonstration, I hope, representation of some examples of transnational history before that can be developed in the future. Now, the first point is, it seems to me that we can all understand transnational history as the history of a transnational age. And if capital can move at the speed of a finger touching a computer board, and labor moves across borders in a magnitude and to a degree that probably has never happened before, and certainly is not controlled by countries' immigration policies. If capital and labor and goods, of course, go around the world with dizzying speed, then it seems to me that we have to make problematize the national boundaries surrounding the history of the First World War, writing it from an historical perspective, which starts and to a degree stops with the nation. Now, why is transnational history difficult? Partly because in schools, everyone learns history initially, and I think this is true around the world, in a national perspective. I believe it's time to change, and that change has already begun. But there's a second reason why it's difficult. One of the difficulties of transnational history is you have to know more than one language. Now, in Norway, that's not a problem. That's given. But unfortunately, in many other countries, France, Italy, when I was teaching at the European University Institute, it was the year that the Italian government had stopped teaching foreign languages in their schools. Italy is a member of the European Union, but in the Italian manner. And I think the same thing is true in France, where foreign languages are, I would say, exceptional in working with colleagues. It is true that more young people work with them, but not a majority by any means. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, when I taught at Cambridge years ago, my students didn't have foreign languages, and my guess is they don't today. So the point about transnational history is that it needs to be translinguistic, and that's hard. The second reason is that transnational history addresses problems such as, is there such a thing as metropolitan history? Paris, London, Berlin being an example. Is there a category which is so big that it needs collectives to work on them? And there's a problem in the historical profession, which is that there is a bias, I would call it a dictatorship, of the individual authorial voice, which makes contributors to collective projects not benefit from doing so for academic preferment or for jobs. And this fetish of individual authorship, which is so deeply ingrained in the historical profession, is an obstacle to the collective work necessary for transnational history. Because the subjects are just too big. For example, can any one person write the history of radical Islam in the 20th century? It's an absurdity to assume that one person can do that. There are many other subjects, the history of, let's say, Jewish life in the 20th century. One country, one language, it's an impossibility. It has to be done collectively, and collective work is not valued by the academy. And it strikes me as one of the really saddest facets of the conservatism of the academy, that it makes transnational history positively dangerous for young people. I can do it, you know, my white hair and tenure and so on, but for other people, it is not easy to do. These obstacles, I think, must be overcome if we are ever to have a European history of the Great War, which is simply too big for any one individual to write. There is no European history of the Great War. There are histories of European countries in the Great War, but not a European history. And that will require collective work. There are initial steps towards it. There's a textbook in Franco-German history of the First World War that has gotten off the ground, but the whole of the Eastern Front is very ill documented. The scholarship of Poland in the First World War, of Russia in the First World War, is just getting going. And it has to be done by large collectives. I believe there's an 8-volume history of the Russian participation in the First World War coming out, where Russian scholars are standing alongside Western scholars in providing what has been absent, which is collective scholarship, which really is transnational in the best sense of the word. The empires fought the war. They fought it transnationally. Everybody knew that it was the case. How can we not answer the question that Rudyard Kipling posed 100 years ago? What does he know of England who only England knows? How can we not phrase it by saying, what does he know of the First World War who only England knows? And you know, I feel in many respects that my own work has been a response to my feelings of discomfort about being a British historian, which is where I started, and the push that I've felt inside my, as it were, scholarly conscience has been towards transnational history for a long time. Now let me tell you how it fits into the historiography. There have been 3 generations of historians writing about the First World War in the 100 years since the outbreak. The first I call the 1914 generation because it very much was written by people who were in positions of authority and power in the interwar years. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace set up the largest single collective project on the history of the First World War, 132 volumes, single-authored volumes, I might add, 132 volumes, which included material on every conceivable part of the war, and is still a very valuable source because it was written by people who were in administrative positions or political positions, which gave them access to papers that were not open at the time. Mind you, official history of this kind has the danger of all official history. Namely, it leaves out what is embarrassing to the particular administrator or bureaucrat at the time, who presents the best case of William Beveridge on food supply in Britain and so on. There are hundreds of others. The second generation I call the 1964, the 50-year afters generation. And this is a generation that had archives. Archives were opened 50 years after, and those archives were both written and visual. And the BBC series on the Great War, BBC Two series on the Great War in 1964, is a great example of how much difference it made to visualize the war and to do so in an extraordinary fashion. It was also a period when critical scholarship began. I give you just the Australian case. Charles Bean, who was a historian, an official historian, who went with the Australian troops to Gallipoli and wrote dozens of books about that experience. Well, stepping aside, as it were, from the founding fathers, from those identified with it, is what history has to be. You have to write at the way the Greek poet Kafavi says, you have to write at an angle to the past in order to understand it. And that meant distance. The man who did it, Bill Gamage, stepped back. And in the 1960s, we could do that because it was possible to write from archives. The third generation, the second generation, I have to say, is the beginnings of transnational history, because in the 1960s generation, unlike the 1914 to 39 generation, the subject of the People's War came to the fore. And this was at a time of efflorescence of social history. Social history understood as the history of social structures, inequality, and social movements. And the First World War, of course, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, was wide open to that understanding. It is also the period when women's history first emerged as a major and essential complement to the male-dominated archives and provided oral historians with access to women's experience of the First World War. So social movements are very important. The people are at the center stage, not the state. Even though, of course, it is the interaction between the two which gave a kind of Marxism flavor to this second generation. The third generation is a post-1975 one, and I say that deliberately because part of it is a reaction to the Vietnam War on the part of scholars in literary fields, Paul Fussell being one of them, Samuel Hines another, which injected a statement not so much that the war should be written from the viewpoint of social movements and social conflict, but from the point of view of cultural forms and the extraordinary power that war has on changing the way in which writers, poets, and artists go about responding to the violence of the 20th century. And that period of creating the cultural history of the war in the 1970s and the 1980s was still national by and large. Fussell wrote about the Great War in modern memory, for which we read the Great War in English memory, for which we should read the Great War in the memory of some English poets in the home counties in London, which of course is a contraction of something called modern memory, which is global, to the national framework. Well, the fourth generation of transnational historians, I think, is responding to all three. And in a way, something that I think we have to appreciate is that this response of transnational historians is very much compatible with the previous approaches taken, but puts them in a different framework. Let me put it to you this way. Transnational history doesn't start with the state and doesn't stop with the state. It takes multiple levels of historical experiences given, levels which are both smaller than and larger than the nation state. For example, I'm going to try to talk to you about Paris, London, Berlin as exemplifying what I call metropolitan history. You see, these cities had what I called an imagined life. Think of Paris, everyone has an imagined definition of it. But they were experienced communities as well. In an afternoon, you can walk from one end of Paris to the other. It's a small city. London's much bigger, but it also has an experienced life through commuting and the railway system and the underground and so on, and the river. Berlin is a more complicated story, but nonetheless, it's one where we can understand that being the capital of an empire, as indeed all three were, Berlin, Paris, and London were imperial capitals, provides a certain locus of journalism and power and editing maison d'édition, publishing houses, and various other accoutrements of imperial glamour, museums, concert halls, cabarets, theaters, which can help us understand that there was a level under that of the nation called the metropolitan experience of the First World War. And it seems to me that this is something which goes to inform the national history of these three countries, Germany, France, and Britain, rather than to displace them. So in this case, transnational history is a way of dealing with problems that are, evidently happen in different places at the same time. And I think this is true in multiple instances. The history of mutiny, for example, happened in different armies for different reasons. No one would write the history of mutiny only from one country's perspective. The history of finance, technology, war economies, logistics, command, they're all general questions. And it seems to me that what I want to suggest to you is that in some places, at some points, we have to realize that the national is not necessarily the most significant nor the most enduring of the levels on which we have to analyze the First World War. Think of the peace treaties when you talk about a transnational approach to a transnational set of problems, is how do you piece the world order together after it has been torn apart violently over 4 years. Harvard scholar Erez Manella has done a transnational history of the peace conference. He calls it the Wilsonian moment. And it's very interesting. How do you link together the fact that when the peace treaty was signed, there were explosions of violence in Cairo, in Amritsar, in Seoul, and in Beijing at more or less the same time. They were all responding to what they understood Wilson meant by self-determination and his betrayal of the earlier commitment as to what that meant. But it was not possible to understand these moments if you took only a national approach to them. Historians of revolutionary moments in Europe from 1917 to 21, or the counter-revolutionary moments, the Freikorps and so on, that wound up all up the German, Polish, and then Baltic coast, these are not nationally comprehensible. And the extraordinary, I think, research that has now been going on the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, on the Armenian genocide, and on the what was called at the time euphemistically population exchange between Greeks and Turks, these are not, by definition, genocide is not a national issue. It is a transnational issue. The survivors wound up all over the world. I would imagine there are some in this country as well, who wound up as cut loose from the Armenian homeland and landed wherever they could possibly put their lives together again. Now, I want to suggest that the transnational moment is also necessary because of the changing sociology of the historical profession. And I mentioned this yesterday, it's worth repeating. The enormous expansion of the system of higher education in Europe and North America between 1960 and 1990, the Antipodes included, was a trebling of the number of people studying for degrees in higher education. And that meant a trebling of the jobs available for people like me, who were born in one country, study in a second, and teach in a third. If people literally have an early life experience in one country, where they grow up, and then do their doctorate and their academic training in a second, and wind up living and teaching in a third, possibly with a different language, certainly with a different accent, even though I've never been able to change mine, other people do, it seems to me that we should understand that historians are now transnational. There are so many historians. The best instance I know about that is in Britain, where I spent most of my academic life. The riches of the British academic world speak, many of them, with a German accent. The cruelties and infantilization of the Habilitationsschrift system in Germany has impelled very talented German scholars all over the world, and in particular in Britain, which is an agreeable place to work for a whole series of other reasons. So what I've wanted to do initially is to say what we need to understand is that transnational history has begun, and it is the wave of the future. I believe that it is necessary for there to be a transnational history of the First World War if the European Union is ever to be more than a Brussels bureaucracy extended all over the continent. A political movement like the European Union needs a common history, needs a sense of the catastrophe of 1914-18 as that, what George Kennan said, it was the Ur catastrophe of the 20th century. They need it. and it can't be done within national units. And I think the change in the habit of writing the history of the First World War has already begun, and that it is right and proper in a forum like this one to bring to your attention this different and innovative and difficult way of doing business. Now, let me try to show you some instances in which this matters by taking the project on Paris, London, Berlin as one example of it. The first thing that I want to suggest is that transnational history is something which involves a series of sources that many historians used to use when I was trained in the 1960s and no longer do. Quantification, quantifiable sources. It strikes me that in many respects, it should be obvious to anybody here that historians have to know how to count as well as they have to know how to read. But counting doesn't count anymore. Quantification has gone the way of all flesh. And that is in part because there's been a major change away from economic history as a central feature of the writing of national history and indeed of global history per se. Now, why has this happened? It seems to me that one reason why economic history has faded, one reason, is that Marxism as a theory of history has collapsed. Now, it is by no means the case, and I'm not arguing this, that economic historians are overwhelmingly Marxist. By no means is that true. But there has been, and there was in the 1960s and 70s, a notion, which I would call more Marxism than Marxist, that indeed quantification is really important. It matters what the standard of living was in the Industrial Revolution. There was a real debate over that. The French school, Les Annales, had quantification at the core of it, right at the centerpiece. If you couldn't count grain prices, you couldn't get a doctorate in France for 20 or 30 years. It was just impossible. And I think the fact that there was, in the 1960s and 70s, a great efflorescence of quantitative work at the same time as there was an efflorescence of work on the history of labor movements and on social forces should explain, I think, the reason why it's faded away. That is to say, Marxism has fragmented and collapsed as a way of explaining or doing history, and various kinds of quantification have more or less turned into adjuncts to economics departments rather than history departments. That economics has taken over the subject of economic history, and it's moved away from history departments. And what I want to say, though, is that this is a very sad and unnecessary development. In fact, I think it's a way of crippling historical study. And I want to show you why. Let me try to do it in terms of very rudimentary problems in the history of the First World War. The first question that I started to study 40 years ago is how many people died in the First World War? How many soldiers died in the First World War? How many people gave their lives for France? National questions. And all those war memorials, how many people? How much did the German population suffer? How eviscerated was Austria-Hungary by the casualties of war? And 40 years later, I have to say, I still have no idea. We have, in the Cambridge history of the First World War, the best current estimate that we can make by Antoine Pro, a distinguished historian who is a quantitative historian as much as anything else, certainly a cultural historian of great distinction. But would you believe it? No one knows to this day what was the human cost of the First World War. No one has any idea about it. All national units of measurement are different. Some of them come from military archives. Some of them come from medical archives. Some of them come from God knows where. I mean, the idea that, for example, the Russian army never counted deaths of prisoners of war. They didn't. So in the Cambridge history just published, we have now added 200,000 to the list of Russians who died in the First World War because the Russian archives said, they're not our problem. Prisoners of war are not our problem. There are other examples. The British statistics stop at the 15th of October, 1918. Why do they do that? I don't know. Some bureaucrat decided it. How am I supposed to find out how many were killed in the last week? Like Wilfred Owen, like the great poet who died on the 4th of November, 1918. He's not on the British casualty lists. And all of the men who died in the last bloody weeks of the war are not there either. So there is a fundamental quantitative question that I suggest has to be approached transnationally in order to make sense. Because if you're simply going to use all of these arbitrary distinctions that each nation has to calculate its own losses, what you are likely to do is to institutionalize underestimation. Why? Because all armies want to say that the other side suffered more. They do. And I'll show you how I tried to handle that in a moment, but I'll give you a second problem, which is transnational in definition and can't be approached in a national way. I did a chapter in the Cambridge History on shell shock. How many people suffered psychological, debilitating casualties such they could not serve anymore in the First World War? No one has a clue. And I'm certainly not prepared to say I know either. But I know a little bit better by putting together all of the national definitions and then realizing where the biases are. The biases, indeed, are partly medical conservatism. The medical profession is very conservative, probably still to this day in Norway, I don't know, but it is in other parts of the world. And some of the medical profession were not conservative, but that they were careful to defend the future interests of disabled men, and thereby put down physical injuries when the real source of disability was psychological injuries in order to make sure that the man gets a pension. If you put down psychological injury, the chances of getting a pension drop like a stone. And I can show anyone who wants later on how I did it, but my guess is that between 1/5 and 1/4 of all the men who were wounded in the First World War had shell shock. And that's between 7 and 10 million men. This is 10 times the previous estimates. Now, what I'm trying to say is that quantification is an essential part of the history of war. Nobody in the direction of the war escaped from the need to quantify food supply, imports, exports. How about quantifying how deep the shell is going to go when it hits the earth? This is the great mistake that the British Army made in not balancing shrapnel, which cuts a man off at the knees, from high penetrative explosive, which unfortunately did not get hurled at the German army in sufficient extent to destroy their underground bunkers on the 1st of July 1916. Quantification is essential to doing the history of war, and my view is it has to be done transnationally in order to make sense of it. Now, I asked the question, how in the world do you get out of this dilemma? And one answer is to start at the national level and then move on. And here's an instance of it. This is an experiment I did. Believe it or not, when I first drew this map, I drew it by hand because when I was working in the mid-1970s, there were no computers. And another difficulty of doing quantification when you have to do the maps yourself. But now, of course, computers can help us out. And this one is a computer of an experiment that I offered. This is from a source in Britain, which is the Prudential Insurance Company's probabilities of dying at any age +1. All of us who have life insurance policies know about these because they determine the premiums that we pay every year. These are called life tables, and all life insurance companies, they're extremely big capital institutions, use estimates of the likelihood of any one of you young people surviving to next year, which is very high, and the probability of my surviving to next year, which isn't as high, but I hope high enough. Now, the important thing to bear in mind is that now allows us, let's see if I can do this. Is there a red line there? Is it red? There it is. This line, which goes from 16 to 32, talks about what the likelihood of dying at any one year was, at any one age, had there been no war. It's called a counterfactual. It is an imaginary and totally unreal estimate of what Britain would have looked like had there been no war. And what it does is projects the pre-war trend of declining mortality onto the period 1914 to 1918. And what this allows us to do is to trace, this is 1915, 16, 17, and 18. It allows us to do a very simple arithmetic of war deaths. Subtract this from these and you get the answer to how many people died in the First World War. Now, I had to invent the statistics. You know, this is a statistical manipulation of life tables, and I needed to learn the statistics of it. It was something that was made easier by the fact that I did a lot of chemistry and mathematics when I was an undergraduate. But it meant that counting actually provided, for the very first time, an alternative to totally fabulous national statistics about the number of people who died in the First World War. Now, the question is, how rigorous are these figures? And the answer, I think, has to be by applying them to other countries. And after I did this initial exercise, I did two others. I kept going because, you know, until the age of 30, 80% of the men who died in the First World War were under the age of 30. But if you carry on the experiment, this is the second one, and this is the third one. I want you to look at this. Do you see this mess here, where everything is jumbled? That is the chances of living to age X plus 1 for anybody age 43, 44, 45, 46, in the counterfactual one saying war didn't happen, and in the years 1914 to 1918. And the answer comes out that at many ages, people were dying in the First World War at rates lower than they would have died had there been no war. In other words, something happened to make their life expectancy in wartime go up. When I first did that, I thought I had made a mistake. I clearly was wrong. How could it be possible that the most murderous war in history actually produced negative war-related mortality at ages after which people were mobilized? And the answer is, could it be that something happened on the home front to increase the life chances of people who stayed out of uniform? And that is the use of quantification. It's not to decide anything, but it is to specify, to make a hypothesis. Is it possible that there were two demographic histories of the First World War, one in which it was murderous, and the other in which it was curiously and unintentionally life-saving? In the Second World War, there's a lot of literature on the Blitz actually being a moment when public health improvements were registered in higher life expectancy for children and for others, but no one had ever said this about the First World War. And believe me, I had a lot of people say, balderdash, your statistics must be faulty. They don't mean a thing. And everybody knows that it was more miserable for working class people during the war than before. Well, I said, not everybody knows, and let's look at it now. And it produced years of research in which I tried to persuade my critics that there was a paradox, that a war in which 1 million people from Britain and the Empire were killed was also a war in which their families had higher life expectation because of the way in which the war economy operated. So what happened after the last review that said, this is complete rubbish? You know, I had a number of reviews that said, this is interesting, but we need to see whether it's really true. There's only one way to do that, and that is to step outside of England. To answer Kipling's question, what does he know of England who only England knows? By going somewhere else. And that produced the Paris, London, Berlin project. It was a way of testing at a lower level of aggregation than the nation state the hypothesis that war economies operated in very strange ways that people hadn't anticipated, and certainly it wasn't a government decision that this should happen, but it worked. Now, what resulted was 20 years of work. The obstacle that I talked to you about before of collective work was one problem. The other is money, and the third is language. But we got together a group of 20 people who were prepared to write a history of the First World War told from the viewpoint of metropolitan experience. And we did it in 2 volumes. The first took 10 years, the second took 10 years. The first volume is on the social and economic history of these 3 cities. The second volume is on the cultural history of these 3 cities, mirroring the change that I was talking about a little bit earlier anyway. And basically what we did was to take a look at these 3 cities in terms of a theory that might explain this strange phenomenon that I tried to show you a moment or two ago, where in some cases, not in all cases, life expectancy in civilian population at war increased, and in other cases it didn't. And the place and the way to do it, you see, was to use, as it were, something outside of the historical profession, to consult the neighbors, to see if there are either theories or suggestions that could help us interpret the finding that I had and other people contested. So this is wide open. And it seems to me that because transnational history is by definition comparative, and by definition has many different things to say about different communities, what we should do is to talk about what would be a standard and a strategy of comparison. And what I thought, and I think it worked, was to move from imagined communities to experienced communities, from nations to cities, is the only way to test the hypothesis that states are too large units to reveal fundamental features of the way war economies function and the way they fall apart. That is why, with 20 other scholars, and together with Jean-Louis Robert of the University of Paris, I put together that 20-year project. And I'm happy to say that every single one of those 20 people has a job, despite the fact that what they did for the collective project probably didn't help them one iota. Now, comparative history requires an analytical framework which can identify both convergences and divergences in the experience of populations that I'm going to show you in a minute. And the organizing approach we used is based on an interpretation in the nature and determinants of adaptation and well-being in these cities. In a snapshot, the argument that we developed to explain the demographic and other phenomenon was that democracies were better at fighting the First World War than authoritarian regimes, because they took into account the well-being of the population in waging the war. And we took this theory of Amartya Sen on entitlements, capabilities, and functionings, for which he won the Nobel Prize in economics, I might say, after we published the first volume and before we published the second. And one of the central arguments that we based on his work is that the nature of citizenship helped determine the outcome of the war. And I'll repeat that. The nature of citizenship helped determine the outcome of the war, because it helped determine the efficacy of the war effort of the Allies and limited the efficacy of the war effort of Germany in defending the well-being of the civilian population. And I want to add right away that the major supporter for my interpretation is Adolf Hitler, who put the misery and deprivation of the home population of the First World War onto the shoulders of Untermenschen in the Second World War. The German population in the Second World War did not suffer, for a whole series of reasons related to spoliation juive and other things, that the Second World War clearly was better. And in fact, there's a historian, Gozali, who talked about how Hitler bought the German people. This is one of the reasons why. The argument is that on the metropolitan level, and through the prior existence of what Amartya Sen calls a system of entitlements, a legal and moral framework upon which distributive networks rest, the Allies did better at protecting the well-being of a population at home than did the Germans or the Austrians. And that soldiers knew it. When soldiers in 1918 in the German army, I have only 3 instances of this, but my guess there are more, sending packages home to their families in Berlin because there are no potatoes left. There are no potatoes. They all got siphoned off into the black market. Then we're knowing something about why soldiers gave up in 1918, why they were prepared to say that what's the point in fighting this war? We can't win it anyway, and our families are suffering at home. As I said, to demonstrate this point, we followed Amartya Sen's innovative framework in departing from the well-established view that the standard of living is a measure of opulence. Instead of aggregating some measures of the value in monetary or calorific terms of a basket of consumables, Sen suggests a more fluid and complex approach to the issue of living standards. This is what he says: the standard of living is not a standard of opulence, even though it is inter alia influenced by it. It must be directly a matter of the life one leads rather than of the resources and means one has to lead a life. I have called the various living conditions we can or cannot achieve our functionings, and our ability to achieve them our capabilities. The main point here is that the standard of living is really a matter of functionings and capabilities and not a matter of opulence, commodities, or utilities. Functioning is an achievement, whereas a capability is the ability to achieve. And using this framework, which I think enabled us to, as it were, set up a way of answering the hypothesis, we went to work in trying to dig up the way in which civilian communities lived during the First World War and to what extent their capabilities and their functionings were undermined. And what we found was an extraordinary pattern of divergence between Berlin and Paris and London after the middle of 1916. In other words, the war should have a chronology in two parts. Between 1914 and 1916, Berlin and the German war effort did just about as well as the Allies. But when the crunch came in the middle of 1916, and the German economy was militarized by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and from their point of view, civilians were not the relevant unit, the devil take the hindmost, the war effort of the Central Powers began to collapse. Now, I don't for a moment believe that there was only one reason why the Germans lost the war. There were many reasons. This is one of them. With respect to work, to wages, and to consumption patterns, capabilities and functionings were compromised more in wartime Berlin than in Paris and London. One of the big findings of this study was that Berlin had probably one of the most highly developed black markets in the world, not London or Paris. They had, people in fedoras and raincoats and so on. They had it like any other city. But the Berlin system required everybody to break the law in order to have enough to eat. It is an extraordinary system in which the position of civilian life was sacrificed to give the army everything it needs. There's a certain logic to that, isn't there? When this is a total war, you have to give the army everything it needs in order to survive and make the breakthrough necessary. Not so. The contrast was primarily an outcome of different sets of social relations and different meanings of citizenship, leading to a different order of priorities about the relative importance of civilian capabilities and functionings as against military needs. The conclusion is that the war should be divided in two halves. At a time when new economic structures were constructed in 1916, both domestically and internationally by the Allies, the German economy began to unravel. Thus, the urban, the metropolitan, the national, and the global interacted to produce the political economy of defeat and victory. But the source of the contrast lay in the way citizenship structured the organization of resources and their distribution in wartime. I don't have time to go through these because I do want to leave moments for conversation, but those who want, I'd be happy to show you. Look at this, 550. This is the increase in the cost of living and the cost of food. This is 1919, 338. You go across, it's not good in London and Paris, but the Berlin scene was worse. And even here, because this is an old-fashioned one, we take it apart in the way in which Sen does. And it shows when we deal with birth rates, Berlin was actually a healthier place to live before the First World War than was London. You see the pre-war, let's see if I can do it. Where's the dot? There's the dot. That's Berlin, that's London. No, that's Paris and that's London. Berlin is in between the two. Look where it is in the middle of the First World War. And we can find this in, I think I have 55 different tables that you will be pleased to know I'm not going to show you. And it shows that the vulnerable members of the population, illegitimate children, the elderly, people in asylums, people in asylums in Berlin were probably starved to death at the end of the First World War because they had no entitlements and hence had no functionings and no capabilities. Conclusion. Let's see if I can finish with that. The conclusion. The history of Paris, London, Berlin has multiple dimensions. The second volume is entirely different from the first. It starts off from Michel de Certeau's perspective that we leave footprints on cities by the way we walk, by the way we use them. In fact, he developed that idea by standing on the World Trade Towers, the ones that were destroyed at 9/11. And he said, understanding a city means understanding how people walk through it. And hence the second volume of Paris, London, Berlin starts at the railway stations, goes into the streets, to the cafes and entertainments, into the public squares, schools, houses, hospitals, and finally cemetery. So it's a walking tour through the cities. That's what the second volume is. And there are multiple areas of that I'd be happy to discuss with you later on, how the contrasts operated. But the first thing that I want to suggest is that the two volumes form a whole. And they form a whole in trying to suggest that it's not just comparison, but moving across national lines that can enable us to provide the beginnings of an answer to why one side won the war and the other side didn't. And I think, by the way, you've had an earlier meeting, I gather, where you discussed the origins, the question of why did the war break out. You had another one in November, I think, or possibly earlier this year, Well, the question, why did one side win and the other side lose, which was embedded in David Stevenson's brilliant summary yesterday, that's still wide open. And I think it's a question which will have to await the opening of the archives in Eastern Europe, and not only in Eastern Europe. It'll have to require transnational history. I am assured I have one more year to go before I retire. The future is there, and we should prepare for it. Thank you very much.